Something enormous is unfolding right now, and most Americans are only getting half the story. In the last 72 hours, the United States and Israel launched military strikes against Iran, and the consequences are already reshaping the entire global order in real time. A British base in Cyprus was struck by a drone. A French facility in Abu Dhabi was targeted. A base hosting Italian troops in Kuwait was hit. Saudi oil facilities were attacked as ships queued outside the Strait of Hormuz. Missiles flew over Bahrain and Qatar. Gulf airspace shut down, and now, the very allies Washington depends on in that region, the UAE and Qatar are privately lobbying allies to help persuade President Trump to reach for an off-ramp that would keep US military operations against Iran short. Think about what that actually means. These are not adversaries. These are America's closest partners in the Gulf, and they are working behind closed doors to pull the United States back from its own war. A senior Western official based in the Gulf said some regional governments believe Trump was pushed into the war by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and is now in deeper than he intended. Meanwhile, the closure of airspaces over Qatar and the UAE, as well as in Bahrain and Kuwait, has stranded tens of thousands of passengers and created the biggest disruption to global travel since the COVID-19 pandemic. This is not just a Middle Eastern conflict anymore. This is a pressure point on the entire global economy, on energy, on trade, on the very credibility of American power. And the question every American should be asking right now is, who is actually in control of this? Let's start with where the hook ended, with that question of who is actually in control. Because that question isn't rhetorical. It's the most important question in geopolitics right now, and the answer coming out of Washington is not reassuring anyone. Trump met repeatedly with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu as they sought to curb Iran's nuclear program. That's the official framing. But look a little closer and a very different picture begins to emerge. A senior Western official based in the Gulf said some regional governments believe Trump was pushed into the war by Netanyahu and is now in deeper than he intended. That is not a fringe opinion. That is the privately held assessment circulating among the very governments that host American military bases, American troops, and American assets, governments that are now absorbing Iranian missiles because Washington made a decision that they were never fully consulted on. Think about what that means structurally. Qatar, the UAE, and Turkey all publicly stated they would not permit their territory or airspace to be used for an attack. These countries drew a line before the war started. They said openly and clearly, do not use us as a launching pad. And yet the moment the strikes began, every single one of them became a target anyway, not because they participated, but simply because they exist in proximity to the conflict and because they host American forces. Their geography became their liability, and that is something no amount of diplomacy could have prevented once the decision was made in Washington. Within an hour of American and Israeli strikes on Iran, Tehran hit Arab states hard on Saturday, widening the war beyond its borders and drawing warnings of escalation from the Gulf. Within 1 hour, not days, not weeks, 1 hour. And in that 1 hour, the entire strategic architecture that the Gulf states had spent decades building, the hedging, the dialogue, the quiet back channels with Tehran, the cultivation of relationships on every side, all of it collapsed. For the first time since 1979, all 6 members of the Gulf Cooperation Council have been implicated within a single escalation cycle. That is a historic rupture. That is not something you walk back from easily or quickly. Now here is where it gets really important for Americans to understand the full picture, because the mainstream conversation in the United States tends to reduce this to a simple binary. You're either with us or against us. You're either pro-war or pro-Iran. But the Gulf states don't fit into either of those categories, and their discomfort right now is a signal worth paying close attention to. Qatar, which helped mediate an Israel-US-Iran ceasefire last summer, shut down its liquid natural gas exports, 20% of the global LNG market, after Iranian drones targeted key facilities. 20% of the global LNG market shut down, not because Qatar chose to exit the global economy, but because the war came to their front door uninvited. And that shutdown is not just a number on a spreadsheet, it is a direct hit on energy prices in Europe, in Asia, in countries that have nothing to do with this conflict and never asked to be part of it. According to a Qatari assessment shared with Bloomberg, prolonged disruption to maritime traffic in the region, particularly if it continues beyond the middle of the week, could trigger sharper reactions in energy markets, with natural gas prices seen as especially vulnerable following an initial spike earlier in the conflict. The Qataris are doing the math. They understand that every day this continues, the economic damage compounds. And they are not just watching, they are actively working behind the scenes to stop it. The UAE and Qatar are privately lobbying allies to help them persuade President Trump to reach for an off-ramp that would keep US military operations against Iran short. That is the diplomatic reality playing out right now beneath the headlines, beneath the war coverage, beneath the footage of explosions and burning buildings. And what makes this even more layered is Saudi Arabia's role, because Riyadh has been playing a very careful, very deliberate game throughout this entire escalation. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman conveyed a message to the leaders of Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates, calling for de-escalation and uniting the 6 Gulf Cooperation Council countries' foreign policy positions to avoid any one actor veering off script. The Saudi foreign minister was on the phone with his counterparts trying to hold the line. Keep everyone together, don't let anyone break ranks, don't let any single country get drawn into a direct exchange with Tehran that spirals beyond what they can manage. That is the work of crisis management at the highest level, happening in real time while missiles are still flying. And yet, here is the tension that no one can resolve easily. Qatar's former Prime Minister, Hamad bin Jassim bin Jaber Al Thani, urged the GCC to adopt a unified approach and not be dragged into a direct confrontation with Iran, warning that a direct clash would deplete the resources of both sides and provide an opportunity for many forces to control them under the pretext of helping them escape the crisis. Read that warning carefully. He is not just talking about Iran, he is warning about the forces that would rush in to help, meaning the powers that benefit from Gulf instability, the powers that sell weapons, the powers that extend influence under the cover of security partnerships. He is warning his own allies to be careful whose help they accept and on whose terms. Meanwhile, back in Washington, the constitutional dimension of this war is becoming impossible to ignore. On February 28th, President Trump, in coordination with Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu, launched what critics called a massive, premeditated military attack on Iran, aimed at removing top leadership and degrading Iran's conventional military capabilities, without congressional authorization or debate as required by Article 1 of the Constitution and the 1973 War Powers Act. Just hours before the strikes began, Omani mediators were reporting that nuclear talks between Washington and Tehran were serious and that a good deal was within reach. And then the bombs fell. The negotiations were buried under rubble, and the United States was at war, again, without a formal declaration, without a public debate, without a congressional vote. Senator Mark Warner, the top Democrat on the Intelligence Committee, said there was no imminent threat to the United States from Iran. The threat was to Israel. That is a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, someone with access to classified briefings, drawing a direct and significant distinction. He demanded that Trump come before Congress and the American people to make his case for war and, crucially, to explain the exit plan. Because as of right now, there is no publicly stated exit plan, there is no defined end state, there is no clear answer to the most basic question any government owes its citizens before sending them into harm's way. What does winning look like? And how do we get there? Even before this weekend's escalation, members of Congress, including Representative Ro Khanna and Representative Thomas Massie, were preparing to introduce a bipartisan war powers resolution to head off unilateral action by Trump in the Middle East, citing fears of another costly, endless war that risks destabilizing the region and endangering American citizens. That bipartisan concern, a Democrat and a libertarian-leaning Republican together before the war even started, tells you something important. It tells you that people who look at the actual strategic picture, rather than the partisan one, were already deeply worried about where this trajectory was heading. Israel's insistence on broadening the terms of any potential nuclear deal to include conditions Tehran would never accept, like curbing its ballistic missile program and severing ties with regional proxies, was described by analysts as a calculated move to ensure diplomacy fails. One expert told Al Jazeera that Israel's current government had moved beyond using military force to achieve political settlements, that war had become the goal itself. Now, whether you agree with that assessment or not, the fact that this analysis is circulating widely among serious regional experts should give every American pause, because if it is accurate, then the United States did not walk into this war, it was guided into it. And the guidance came from a foreign government with its own strategic interests, which may or may not align with American interests in the long term. In the short term, the Gulf monarchies will be under pressure to maintain the narrative of calm at home. On Monday, top Emirati officials toured a shopping mall to convey a literal sense of business as usual, while Dubai-based influencers converged on the same theme. But beneath that carefully managed optics campaign, the structural damage is real and growing. For years, the GCC states presented themselves as havens of stability and opportunity for mobile talent and capital, contrasted with a regional backdrop of political conflict and economic stagnation. But attracting tourists, building and operating data centers, and sustaining complex logistical hubs is difficult in the middle of an active war zone. These are not abstract concerns. These are the economic foundations of states that have spent a generation building themselves into global connective tissue, financial hubs, travel hubs, energy hubs, logistics hubs. And all of that is now under threat, not from their own choices, but from a war they explicitly said they did not want. Kuwait Stock Exchange implemented a trading suspension until further notice. Saudi Arabia's main index was down nearly 1.5%, while Qatar's main benchmark traded down nearly 2%. Markets do not lie. Markets reflect what institutional money actually believes about risk, and right now institutional money is pricing in a scenario where this conflict does not resolve quickly and cleanly. It is pricing in the possibility of prolonged disruption, of sustained pressure on shipping lanes, of energy supply chains that do not normalize within days or weeks. And here is the piece of this that ought to concern every American who fills up their gas tank, pays a utility bill, or watches their retirement account. Iranian strikes have led to the shutdown of major energy facilities, affecting around 20% of the world's LNG supply. The Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 1/5 of all globally traded oil passes, is now a contested maritime corridor in an active conflict zone. Every ship captain making decisions about routing right now is calculating risk premium. Every insurance underwriter is adjusting their rates. Every energy company is wargaming supply disruption scenarios, and all of that cost, every cent of it, eventually flows downstream to ordinary Americans, to their heating bills, their gas prices, their grocery costs, because energy is embedded in the price of everything. Tehran understands it cannot win a conventional war against the United States or Israel. Its strategy is therefore not oriented toward decisive victory, but toward cost imposition. By striking one of the world's most globally integrated commercial hubs, the UAE, Iran signaled that Gulf prosperity itself is leverage. That is a ruthlessly rational strategic doctrine. You cannot outgun America, but you can make the war expensive enough, disruptive enough, and prolonged enough that the political will to sustain it eventually collapses. In Washington, in allied capitals, in public opinion. That is not a new strategy. It is exactly what drove the United States out of Vietnam, out of Lebanon, out of Somalia, and into exhausted withdrawals from Iraq and Afghanistan. Iran is playing the long game. The question is whether Washington has a strategy for that reality, or whether, as several senators are already asking, the administration walked into this conflict without one. Senator Andy Kim of New Jersey, who served as Iraq director at the White House National Security Council, told Time that lawmakers and the public were being asked to accept military escalation without understanding the endgame, warning that talk of regime change could empower hardline factions within Iran and draw the United States into deeper commitments. That warning about regime change is critically important, because the death of Ayatollah Khamenei, the man who held ultimate authority in Iran for over 3 decades, has now raised a question that nobody in Washington seems to have a clear answer to. What comes next? Who fills that vacuum? And is whatever comes next more amenable to American interests or less? History offers a sobering track record on that question. From Iraq to Libya, the elimination of a governing regime without a credible plan for what follows has consistently produced chaos that outlasts the military campaign by years, sometimes by decades. The Gulf states understand this. They have lived in the neighborhood. They remember 2003. They watched what happened when the architecture of the Iraqi state was dismantled and the region absorbed the consequences for the next 20 years. That is precisely why there was an emerging consensus among Gulf leaders that Iran's retaliatory strikes were lesser in intensity than expected, and that the Gulf states should avoid taking any direct action that could elicit an angry response from Tehran. They are threading an extraordinarily difficult needle, defending their sovereignty, standing alongside Washington publicly, while simultaneously doing everything they can behind the scenes to bring this to a negotiated end before the escalation becomes truly unmanageable. What we are witnessing in real time is the gap between the way power presents itself and the way power actually works. The presentation is confidence, surgical strikes, strategic objectives, decisive action. The reality is a web of pressures, competing interests, unintended consequences, and partners quietly working to limit the damage of decisions they were never truly part of making. The UAE and Qatar are not acting out of weakness when they push for an off-ramp. They are acting out of a clear-eyed understanding that in a prolonged regional war, there are no winners in the Gulf, only varying degrees of loss, and the pressure they are bringing to bear on Washington right now is not pressure from adversaries. It is pressure from allies. That distinction matters enormously. When your closest partners in a region are lobbying for you to stop, that is not opposition to American power. That is a warning sign from people who know the terrain far better than any policymaker sitting in Washington ever will.